Okay, let's kick this off. Um, so let's talk briefly about Burn, so we know exactly where we are and what we're doing. So Burn is looking to address the lack of black people in senior leadership positions, and we're looking to help and develop and press the community so that we can level up and build back stronger in this new normal that we find ourselves. So that's our role. We are a support function for the black community. In terms of today, we offer this boost session as almost a midweek marker to make sure that you're on track with your goals. And to that end, what we tend to do is get a series of speakers whose stories will motivate, challenge, and enlighten. So I'd like to introduce today's speaker, who is Sharon Amesu. Um, I I could I could give you a brief bio, but I think it's better if I jump out of the way and we can let Sharon share her story from the beginning. Is that all right with you, Sharon?
Goodness me, where would you like to begin? There are so many different points of a beginning.
Um, let's start with your work around leadership and inclusion. So we'll start from the now and then we can work our way through your history. Is that all right?
For sure. Okay, so my work around, hello everyone, first of all. I'm delighted to see you all. It really is a pleasure to meet you. I always find it a great privilege when people are willing to spend time to hear something of your story. So thank you very much for joining the call today. I guess I've always been involved in some form of leadership. I was raised in a Christian home. I grew up in a church community, and in the church community that I grew up in, the notion of not being involved in some form of leadership at the earliest age was just never going to happen. Everyone had to find their voice in some way. And so from an early age, I was involved in leading some form of group, whether it was a women's group or a youth group. There was some form of leadership that I was involved in and understood, therefore, and grasped just how challenging it is to lead other people, and to marshal and galvanize and convene people. I also had a sense of leadership from an observer's perspective. So my dad was a community organizer, a community convener, a social activist, and I saw how he brought parents together. It was West Indian parents that he convened in particular during the early 80s, late 70s. And I saw how important leadership was. So I had a grasp of that. The specific work that I started to do around supporting leaders in my work life, as it were, began around about 10 years ago. And that was when I was introduced to coaching, actually. And it was quite serendipitous the way it happened, even though I don't necessarily believe in serendipity. But the way it came about was completely unplanned and without any orchestration. But I came across coaching and fell in love with this idea of using the power of questions to draw on people's inner resource and enable people to deepen their self-awareness in order for them to grow. And I recognized early on in my journey the power of working with leaders in that space, because leaders make such important decisions on other people's lives that affects community. So my work around working with leaders really began then, and it tied in with my previous career, which was working in law, and I can tell you more about that. But throughout, if you sort of cut me with a knife, the theme throughout will be like a stick of rock from Blackpool would be justice. It's one of my core values, which was deep-seated and seeded early. And so that married that aspiration to support leaders, really married with this core value that I have of justice, and recognizing the various circles that I've operated in and the spheres of influence that I've been involved in, I would often see that I was the only person in the room, and that there were so many important voices. I'd be in a room and I would hear an issue arise, and I wouldn't necessarily have the level of knowledge or skill to be able to address that, but I knew someone from my community, my head, who would have offered a brilliant solution to that. So I had a growing frustration, Basil, that actually that it cannot be the case that we have all of these rooms which don't have a certain demographic or inadequate representation of that demographic, and it stay as it is. So I joined an organization which supports leaders very specifically. It's the Institute of Directors. And I became the branch chair for the Greater Manchester branch, largely because I recognized the importance of working with directors who were making decisions at board level roles. But also I was very, very keen to bring exposure within the organization, which was of a certain ilk for a period of time and still continues to be honest, which lacked any real connection with a wider demographic. And so it became my mission in that role to really be a bridging force, as it were, to bring people from predominantly the Black community, but also more broadly, into the IOD, bring the IOD into the Black community, and really get a sense of, all right, what are the skills that are complementary, that can really help to improve society for all when we really collaborate and bring cohesion. So I did quite a bit of work around that agenda within the Institute of Directors, and it's really continued from there, this focus on leadership development and diversity and inclusion.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Sharon. Now, I noticed that, you know, something that you mention quite a lot is authenticity. Can you just talk a little bit about how authenticity shapes and frames leadership, and what we mean by that?
If there's one thing that, one of the most significant influences in my personal life, Basil, has been my dad. My dad recently passed due to COVID-19, but his legacy very much continues on in my life and will continue to do so throughout my entire career. And one thing that I noticed about him, both at the time in the moment, but also retrospectively as one reflects, was how real he was. Like, what you saw with him is what you got. And if you did not like it, so be it. And he had a level of courage about him that either repelled or appealed, but certainly he was what he was. And that was very grounding for me, and it enabled me to be sure-footed in spaces where I would have lost my identity otherwise. And what I recognized early on is I've seen, because especially when you're in spaces where you are the minority, it is so easy to be lured into this losing of your right. Who am I in this space? And you can become a clone of something in every form but your physical appearance. And I've seen people lose themselves, and it's not very pleasant to see, where you become a shadow of yourself because you've conformed to what you believe the expectation is of you. And I'm not saying it's easy to resist. It is incredibly difficult to truly be who you are, and I don't always marry up to that. However, what I found is the value in just being me and showing up as me. And people then are either drawn to that or they find it repels them. But where I found those points in my journey where there has been connect between who I know I am and who I'm showing up as, yes. That dissonance, it is destructive for me. And I find myself just really reflecting on how I've behaved, or what I've said, or what I might have laughed at, that I wouldn't need, that I don't want to laugh at because that's not me. And so growing in my self-confidence and my sure-footedness and knowing who I am, and therefore conveying that and showing that truly, I believe, is essential for good leadership. It's essential for me, but it's essential for good leadership, because otherwise people discern the quality of your character. People are much more discerning than perhaps we think they are. And when they see that you are not who you say you are, you're Janus-faced, and so you're one person here, but you're another person elsewhere, then they don't trust your leadership. And that's why we see a real lack of belief. We see a lack of trust in so many key areas of society, not least politics. We see that because there is a lack of authenticity. People will say what needs to be said to the baying crowd, but there's a cost to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a degree, isn't there, of self-disclosure that goes along with authenticity. So, for example, I used to play music, but I thought I'd separate the two. When I'm in work, I'm not going to talk about music, but then whether you talk about it or not, people are aware of it. So when you ask people to do something, they're taking in the whole character, even those bits of yourself that you feel you haven't necessarily kind of revealed to people. So that whole notion of authenticity, I think, goes hand in hand with self-disclosure. And of course, you're going to have to work out how much of yourself you're willing to disclose to those people around you.
You're absolutely right, Basil. You're absolutely right. So this, what sometimes mistakenly is associated with authenticity, it's absolute unfiltered self-disclosure.
Yeah.
That's not this, and that nor is that necessary. And it actually has to be appropriate, and it has to be contextual.
Yeah.
Because there is no point in the name of authenticity revealing things about yourself in a space where you know it'll be critiqued or ridiculed, or there'll be condescension toward it. Absolutely, we don't throw our pearls to swine, as it were. That's not what this is about. But it is, I feel that authenticity is very much about having a deep sense of knowing yourself.
Yes. Who
am I? And what are my non-negotiables in life? And where do my boundaries sit? And what are my values? And the more we solidify the answers to those questions in our mind, the more, just in proper context, we will show up authentically.
Yeah, super. Now, you made mention there, again, and once again, this has come up a few times. You talked about values, and you said your core value was justice. Could you just expand on that a little, please?
Yeah. So I really believe that undertaking a regular exercise of identifying and reconnecting with our values is fundamental to how we show up in the world, whether it's just living with each other or leading other people. The more I know what my values are, the more I'm able to live them out because I'm connected to them. So, for example, one of mine, as you say, is justice. Another one of mine is courage. And I'll speak about courage first of all, and then I'll come to justice. The reason why it's important for me to regularly connect with my value of courage is because I often come up against situations where fear steps in. Fear comes up, and it would, had I not been connected to my value of courage, then fear would win. But I know one of my values is courage. And so when fear steps up, I am deeply rooted in this knowledge that I must feel the fear and do it anyway, because that's courage. And I'm connected with that. And so too with justice. Justice is one of my core values. And just in parenthesis, really, any value taken to the extreme, can be self-defeating. So if you're absolute about justice, but you don't have mercy in there, then you become a tyrant.
Yeah.
So I'm conscious of how I live out my values and how the context that they have. However, back to justice. Well, that came about for me because, as I was alluding to earlier, I grew up in the 70s and 80s in Manchester. I grew up in Whalley Range. And the neighbouring district to that is Moss Side. And around the early 80s, there was real civil unrest. And I point back to that time as though it no longer exists. It just manifests in different forms, but it still very much is the case, right? But it was much more the racism experience, in particular within the West Indian community, was very acute, overt, and pronounced. And the relations between law enforcement and the Black community was crumbling, really, and fragile at best.
And then obviously we would pay the bill.
I think Mr. Garfield Crease may not know that he's not on mute. So we're fragile at best. And that was across the UK. So we had, as a result, these tensions mounted and culminated in the Moss Side riots and the Brixton riots and the Toxteth riots, Nottingham, and so on. Also at that time, we had real issues, and we continue to do so now, but again, the agenda was much more overt in relation to Black children in the education system and the marginalization, the exclusion of Black children within education, and in fact, an agenda which was very much about the sidelining of Black children into suboptimal education. It was in that particular context that my dad found his voice. I'm one in our household, in my household when I was growing up, I had two older siblings, and they were very much fell victim to this systemic racism, which does exist. It's not an anomaly. It's not a created idea. It exists. And they were very much a victim of that in their environment, in their school. And I remember my dad finding his voice and speaking to those issues, but also a number of parents coming to the fore and saying, we're experiencing this too. And so as a result, he became this convener for these parents, where they came and brought their collective voice to challenge the issues of the day, because the injustice that they were facing was having a knock-on impact on their generation to come. And these were people who'd come over from the West Indies with a real sense of ambition and drive and aspiration, and were being told that there was a threshold or a limit to what they could achieve, and certainly what their children could achieve. Yeah. It was unjust and it was unfair. And I had this very early sense of doing the right thing and what is wrong, and how mistreating people for completely superficial reasons was wrong, fundamentally wrong, and that I had a part to play in using my voice to address those issues. And so that theme of justice has permeated every area of my life and all of my career choices to date. I practiced law for 16 years as a criminal barrister, and the driver for that was justice. And in the work that I do now, it's very much is the case. How do we ensure that the society that we are raising our children in is just and equitable for all? How do we ensure, what part do I have to play in ensuring that when my children make an application for a job, they don't have to hold this belief that they may not be regarded as eligible solely because of one characteristic over which they have no agency nor would want to, and that being the color of their skin. That cannot be, it cannot be fundamentally right. So that notion of justice is very much a theme.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Now, you made brief reference to your time in criminal law. Can you just share some of your experience in that field? What was that like? What did you see? Were there patterns that revealed themselves to you? Just share that with us.
So I entered the legal profession with a real sense of purpose. And again, had I not had that sense of purpose, I don't believe that for a second I would have lasted in the profession for 16 years. Had I not had a really strong, grounded sense of why I was there, what my mission was, what my purpose was, then the various obstacles came my way would have very much floored me and derailed me. And I entered the profession again because of my belief that the law was a mechanism for bringing about justice for all, a mechanism, very much a flawed mechanism, but notwithstanding that, very much a mechanism. My early experiences in many ways were mixed. So I have often spoken of the fact that the early stages of my career were very much championed by white male colleagues. And to this day, I am incredibly grateful for them seeing my potential, believing in my potential, and championing me. And opportunities that would not have happened otherwise, it was because of white male colleagues who stood their ground. Let me say this, who stood their ground against colleagues who would not have wanted to give the opportunity, very, very clearly and very distinctly. But they were willing to do that. They were willing to stand in the gap and be a voice. And I remember feeling very, very much this sense of imposter syndrome, Basil. I was completely, in many ways, out of place. When you are being, when you're training, when you're on the journey toward becoming a barrister, you have to be called into the profession. It's a very old profession. It dates back to the 14th, 15th century, and therefore it very much is of its age in many ways. And you're called into the profession through what's known as an inn of court. And an inn of court, they're all based in London. And you would go to this inn of court and you'd have to attend, at the time, I believe it was about 24 dinners. So I'd have to go to dine at the inn of court and would have a 4-course meal. In this inn of court, I chose Middle Temple. And I remember walking through the portals of this building, which was incredibly old, ancient, and ornate, and thinking to myself, what on earth am I doing here? And I looked around these walls, which were heavily adorned with these coats of arms. And at the time, I had no idea what a coat of arms was. And when I heard about these coats of arms, I thought, don't all coats have arms? What do you mean? What's a coat of arms? Coat of arm. So I walk in, and then we sit down, and there's this plethora of knives and forks and spoons. And I think, how many do you need? Surely you just need a pair. That's okay. And then next to me, people are talking about riding their horses and they're jogging along. And I thought, horses? The closest that I have come to horses is riding a donkey at Blackpool. Totally different world to my own, alien to me on so many levels. So I felt very, very much out of place. And it's interesting, actually, how that feeling of being out of place, of walking into a robing room when you put on your attire in the court centre, and seeing in that room there is no one else who looks like you, and going into the courtroom itself and seeing a jury who really principally don't look like you, and a judge who doesn't look like you, and none of your peers looking like you. And this was over 20 odd years ago. I was the first Black woman to enter the set of chambers that I joined. As it happened, however, the set that I joined was very progressive and very embracing, and I felt very, very welcomed. So I didn't have a problem there at all. It was very positive. But in general terms, it it was incredibly difficult to navigate. And it comes back to my point around being authentic in that space. How do you resist? I'm of Jamaican descent, and Jamaican humor and using our sort of our colloquialisms is very much a part of who I am, and I love to drop those every now and then, Basil. But in the robing room, how do you be yourself in that? How are you truly yourself in that? How do you connect with people in a way which is real to you, but also accessible for them? And there was real navigation around that. That was a real challenge for me, a real challenge. There were instances, and so much is reported now of the experiences that many Black counsel have. It's interesting because in the main, my experience was positive, and that's because I'd imagine walking through a corridor in court and being the only Black woman. My name was unusual. My name was Amesu. That's my husband's name. And so I was distinct in that way, and therefore didn't have many occasions where the color of my skin was an obvious barrier. But I do recall, certainly when I was out of Manchester and in other more parochial court centres, experiences of being talked over by judges, or being ignored by judges, or just not being addressed, or my name being mispronounced and no effort being made to correct it, or to inquire as to what it was. That, I'm grateful, however, was not the majority of my experience. And most often you'd have judges who would say, "How do I pronounce your name, please?" And seek to understand how to do that better. All of that being said, though, Basil, there is a long way to go. There is such a long way to go. And I hear the experiences of my daughter, who's coming behind me in the profession, and her challenges, which are similar to my own. And I think the profession, unfortunately, like many other professions, has not made the level of progress at the pace and scale that one would certainly have hoped it would have done by now.
True. Absolutely. I think, sharing your experience and hearing you say, or rather you ask the question, what am I doing here? That's really, really powerful. When one considers, what you've gone on to do, knowing that you were asking that question, that's really good of you to share that. It really is. Now, you just share with us your reasons for moving out of criminal law, and where did you jump to next?
Yeah, so I had been in practice for around about 12 years. And there was a point in my career where I decided that I wanted to focus on women who had experienced domestic abuse. And if you recall, I said to you, one of the reasons why I entered the profession was my belief that the law should be used as a mechanism to enable voice. But I found increasingly that was, certainly in the context of domestic abuse, that was not always the case. And the women who, and it was disproportionately women, the women who came into the system often found themselves emasculated by the process. So they'd have the courage, first of all, to report to the police. And oftentimes the research points to the fact that it can take up to 7 times of a woman experiencing some form of domestic violence stroke abuse before they actually report to the police. So a woman would have the courage to report to the police, and then when they do, there'd be all sorts of negative experiences that they would have, whether they'd be disbelieved, disregarded, whether there'd be some piece of evidence which was properly processed, just the way in which they were handled through the process, the lack of communication. And then they would often lose confidence, because it takes courage. And what one has to understand in that context as well is that many of these women if not almost all of these women, they're in a situation which is incredibly vulnerable and volatile, where they are at risk, or their children or their children are at risk. And so there's often lots of threat or influence that comes externally about them pressing on with giving evidence. It's very, very challenging. And so I would find myself in a situation where I'm wanting to help and enable voice, but then you'd find the women who are feeling emasculated and lacking the courage to speak up for good reason, even where there was special measures in place to protect the giving of their evidence. And I just found myself in this almost this circular situation. It was cyclical, of having the same women coming through with the issues unresolved. And I found myself saying, actually, this is not where I feel empowerment begins. It starts earlier than this. Right. Enabling voice starts earlier than being at the criminal justice end of this. And that, as I said, coincided with me being introduced to coaching. And I went myself on a journey through coaching and loved it. I went from being this left brain, just rational thinker, to really being much more creative in my thinking about my whys and my purposes and so on, just doing deeper reflection on that, and understanding how that deepening of self-awareness is actually a point of strengthening my perspective and my ability to face the world and take courage. So I knew that I wanted to do that sort of work with women. And that's what really led to the transition, my frustration with what I was experiencing about the criminal justice system, and this new thing which emerged in my life. And I also don't believe in coincidence. I used the word serendipity earlier on. Actually, I really believe in calling and vocation. And I had a real sense that my season within the criminal justice system had come to an end, and there was a new, fresh perspective, a fresh engagement in the world that I needed to operate in and undertake, which still carried through the theme of justice, but would impact people in a different way. And so I leaned into that and launched my coaching and consulting business about 7 years ago.
Super. So was it going on the coaching course that was the ignition point for you, or was it an accretion of several different incidents?
Yeah, really great question. I suspect that it was an aggregation of all of those, and what the unrest, the inner unrest, began before the coaching program. But what the coaching program gave me is a means by which I could engage and support people. I'd never been exposed to coaching before. I had no idea at all about it. And in relative terms, it's quite new to the UK, and certainly was back then, even now. So I had no idea about it. All I knew at the time was, this is no longer, I'm finding that this is no longer fulfilling for me, and in fact is incredibly frustrating for me. I know I want to do something else. I don't know what that is. Here is coaching. Oh, I like this. This is what I want to do. And that, I think, is the process that unfolded.
Excellent. Now, when it comes to coaching, the perception is that coaching is you giving answers to people's problems, but that's not how it works at all, is it, Sharon?
No, not at all. Coaching is quite the opposite, actually. Coaching is very distinct from mentoring, and very distinct from counseling, because there's confusion around all of those areas, actually, and very distinct from consulting as well. Coaching, and this is what I love about coaching, is that coaching assumes agency within the individual. It assumes that you have the skills and the capabilities and the capacity, and what you have are blind spots. And what coaching does is, through the series of questions, helps you to see where those blind spots are and understand more about yourself, and where, in fact, that latent capabilities, where they rest. And in fact, Basil, I ever committed, like the journey of becoming a better coach for me is a lifelong one. It's such a brilliant way to work with people. I find it so fulfilling working with senior leaders on this. And I continue my learning. So I'm just about to complete a program with the University of Cambridge. It's an advanced diploma in executive coaching, because I'm so committed to really becoming the best coach that I can be in supporting people. And what I found actually on this program is it sharpened my own awareness and understanding of the need to be less directive.
Yes.
And being more non-directive. And that's a skill in itself. It's a skill. It's easy to just go be more, to be more of a leading questioner, where you're taking someone on a particular direction, toward a particular direction, on a particular journey, toward an agenda. It's much more of a skill to lean out and really just hold space and help people to find their way through gentle guidance in your questioning. But coaching is very much about assuming the agency is in the individual, not telling them the answers. Now, there are times, of course, when people get stuck. And I've been myself in situations where I'm stuck and I'm just up against a buffer and I can't get past it. No matter how many questions you ask me, I just can't see it. And there we can sort of adopt and adapt our coaching style in the moment to help and support and bring in some direction. But my own practice, my style, is much more about assuming agency, being non-directive, and being a supportive sounding board and thinking partner.
And that's really, really significant. I love the way that you frame it in that notion of agency within the person that you're coaching. A great example that was given to me to frame coaching is, for example, a coach would be no good to me if I wanted to play tennis, because I can't play tennis. Coaching a tennis player is, okay, you're playing Roger Federer next week. How many backhands do you need to get into Andre Agassi's forehand court? You know, so it's those kinds of things. You know, the skills are within the person that you're coaching. So that's brilliant. Thank you so much for that. Now, you mentioned your daughter coming up after you, Sharon. Have you seen that she's encountering exactly the same barriers that you came up against? Is she, have some of those barriers or hurdles been lowered? What are you seeing from your daughter's experience coming up behind you?
Well, what's really interesting about this is that my daughter is coming from this from a different perspective. So she's very much used my ceiling as her floor. And the level of expectation she has about what she's capable of achieving in the world it is much more advanced and mature than mine ever was at her age. So, for example, I would never at her age have been thinking about, well, what's the representation of the panel that I'm speaking on? It would never have entered my age, my mind in my early 20s, because I wasn't speaking on a panel. It wouldn't. What was a panel? Who was speaking on one? Where were they? So there are different considerations which were in existence, certainly, when I was making my way through my early careers, that would not have been in my consideration at that stage because of my lack of exposure, the fact that I was one of the first in my family to go to university. There's just things that you just won't know because you've not been exposed to it. So they're different in the sense that she has positioned herself for a level of engagement which is different to my own. And she's positioned herself for different types of battles, as it were, than I would have been. So I hadn't been involved in setting up an organization in my 20s, which was championing Black female leaders to enter senior leadership and board level positions. She is. And so she's very much conscious of, well, what are the challenges that my peers are facing? What are we up against? What are the issues? What are the mindsets? What are the behaviors that we need to come against, not simply within my own discrete profession, but across the board? And so the challenges are still very pervasive, less, and in many ways, perhaps more insidious because they're less covert. They're overt, they're more covert.
Yeah.
And because they're more covert, they're less easy to discern. And you have to think more deeply about what's going on here. What is the actual dynamic here? And that takes a different level of sensitivity and a different strand to your antennae about what's going on in the zeitgeist.
Yes.
That I didn't necessarily have to dig into in the same way. Notwithstanding that, we still have issues of do issues of underrepresentation in the profession still exist? Most definitely they do. Do we still have challenges of women in the legal profession and how they navigate work and home? Most definitely they do. Are there considerations that she will be thinking about? Most definitely they are. Are there considerations I have to think about? Most definitely they are. So yes, there are many themes which remain the same, but there are some which are slightly different because of where she has positioned herself on this agenda of justice and equality.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Sharon. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions from the attendees. This is from Mike C. He says, is it fair to say that mum was able to coach daughter's blind spots via osmosis?
Wow. Wow, what a multi-leveled question. So let me just think through what you're asking, Mike. Did I coach my daughter through is it through my own blind spots?
Through her blind spots.
Through her blind spots. What's interesting about my daughter is her profound degree of self-confidence and independence. And I don't necessarily believe that she has consciously warred against the following, but they have been very much in existence. One, people say, and I will accept, she looks like me. And two, she's entering the legal profession as a barrister. And so she's had to contend with this notion of following in your mother's footsteps and doing what your mum's done, as opposed to people understanding you could not find, of all of my three children are fiercely independent. Like, they are bordering rebellion most of the time, but certainly non-conforming. They have a very clear sense of identity and who they are. Notwithstanding that, we have a brilliant relationship. So she is very much open to my input and my insights and being aware of my experiences. But what I have learned from being parent to these three children is that the more I balance being hands-off and saying, learn from my mistakes, the better for our relationship. And it is very much about encouraging them not to have to learn lessons that they don't need to learn through error, but also understanding part of life is learning through their own mistakes, and developing their sense of self through understanding more about what worked for them and what didn't. So her own coaching her on her own blind spots, that happens sometimes, but to a limited degree, Mike, because she very much likes to be her own woman.
Brilliant. I've got a couple more questions for you. I've got a big one from Dean, so I'll save that for just.
I know Dean's will be a big one.
Yeah. So this question is from Lisa. Lisa asks, what would you advise when it comes to overcoming imposter syndrome?
It's a really interesting question, Lisa, because I don't necessarily believe that one absolutely can or does. My sense is that I experience it as much as I'm willing to lean into new spaces. And for me, I must do that for my continued growth and evolution. I must continue to lean into unfamiliar territory that I've not navigated before. And therefore, by so doing, I will have a sense of, oh gosh, I'm here. What do I contribute in this space? What's expected of me? I had it yesterday. You know, I had it yesterday in a meeting. I've got, there's an event coming up in September where I'm due to go down with a group to the House of Commons to sit with Northwest MPs. And when I received this invitation, I thought, yes, Lord. Okay. And rather than leaning out, which could be sort of my immediate unconscious, subconscious reaction, as it were, I leaned in. And I know where imposter syndrome might come up, but I say, all right, what's going on for me here? And I think of purpose, Lisa, I really do. Like, I often ask myself the question, this helps me a lot actually, how would I want my daughter to respond in this situation should she confront it? How would I want my daughter to show up in this room should she be in this room? Would I want her to shrink or to show up? And I also make a commitment, Lisa, that one of my favorite quotes is by someone called Donna Markova. And she says, I will not die an unlived life. She says, I choose to inhabit my days. I will not live in fear of falling or catching fire. And I grasped that, and I say, I'd rather go forward and mess up than not have gone at all. Mm. And because I've adopted that mindset, I found myself in the most incredible places, but also knowing that every door that I push through, Lisa, every table, every unfamiliar table that I sit at creates opportunity for someone else who looks like me to sit there. Mm. So I also don't have time to wallow in my imposter syndrome. It's too costly.
Mm. Super. How was that for you, Lisa?
Yeah, no, that was brilliant. I was just interested because earlier in your talk, you did reference imposter syndrome. So it was just interesting to hear your kind of what you would advise.
Yeah.
Like you're right. You know, it's not something that you ever kind of get over. I think it's something that will always be with you in varying amounts.
Yeah, it just varies, Lisa. It varies in context. It varies in degrees. But what I have determined, remember I said one of my values is courage. And so I will not let that sense of imposter syndrome stop me. I will not. And also, can I tell you what I do, Lisa? I received an encouragement from a mentor several years ago. And she said to me, whenever you go into a room and there's an opportunity to speak, ask a question or something of that sort, be the first. Push yourself out there. And so what will happen is I'll ensure that I do my preparation as is within my power. And then before my mind can stop me, when I'm asked, when the question goes out, invitation goes out, are there any questions? I'll shoot my hand up. And the person will come over and go, so you've got a question. And I'll be saying, the narrative that will be running at the time, Lisa, is, oh my gosh, I'm really scared right now. What else am I going to say? But my hands are already up. And so I have to do that. And I make a decision about the following: knowing who I am, knowing what matters to me, and knowing how I want to show up. Mm. And I get those clear in my mind before I go anywhere. Knowing who I am, knowing what matters to me, and knowing how I want to show up. And the clearer I am on those as I go into any room, the more I can mitigate imposter syndrome.
That's brilliant.
That's great. Thank you.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Sharon. Got a question here from the wonderful Dean, and I'll read it verbatim. So, given that Boris has triumphed over institutional racism, how does that change the focus of Black leaders, especially those of Caribbean descent, in bringing those communities to a level of social and economic parity?
Dean, why? Why, Dean? Why? So, my answer is going to be completely circuitous, I'm sure, to your question, Dean. The report emerged, and I can honestly say that it was I'd imagine that it was compounding of various other issues that had been going on in my life, perhaps, at the time. But what I experienced was the deepest level of exhaustion I've ever experienced in my life. I've never known fatigue like it, actually. Like physical, there was a physical manifestation of fatigue. So it wasn't just psychological. I had a physiological fatigue because I know the challenge that we have faced over my lifetime, let alone before my lifetime. And it felt like a gut punch in many ways. Even now, I feel really emotional. I feel emotional about it. I feel that the only thing that I can say, Dean, is this. And even this feels beyond aspirational. My only hope is that it serves the purpose, which it has already done in part, to galvanize collective voice against it. And I can't recall a report, certainly in my memory, that has galvanized such outright objection and repulsion to its findings. And it has convened and congregated voices which have pointed the collective finger at it and said, that is disgraceful. It's so fun at its most fundamental base level. It is the ultimate in disgrace. And to your point, my hope is that it will continue the work of convening those who are find it repugnant and are repelled by it, and will help us to become even more fiercely determined, notwithstanding our fatigue, who will become even more fiercely determined to address the issues that are clearly extant by virtue of the government being able to sign its name to such a report in modern Britain.
Super. Did that answer your question, Dean? Okay, and just one final question from Rosalie. What would you advise? What did you draw courage from in the moments when you felt knocked down or discriminated against in a white male-dominated industry?
So thank you for your question. Two main things, actually. One is my strong sense of three things. One, my strong sense of self. And that was forged early on. My parents were very clear about me being able to achieve anything that I wanted to achieve. And they were incredibly supportive and championing and cheerleading of my ambition. So a strong sense of self. My faith. So I'm a Christian, and having a real sense of vocation and purpose, and knowing that I'm a part of a program that is much bigger than me, and that I'm in service to something much greater than I am, has been completely profound and compelling in drawing me forward. And finally, legacy. So legacy is a theme that a community that I've launched with my daughter is called She Leads for Legacy. And that's because I've got this strong, compelling sense that I have to be a good ancestor, that we are all ancestors. And I want it to be the case that the life that I've lived on this planet means that the generations who are coming behind me can say she played some part in making it better. And so when I come up against those obstacles, those are the three things that really help me to stay going. Keep going.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Sharon, we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you so much. I've gotten a lot from this talk. I've actually written 4 sides of A4, so thank you so much. Lots for me to digest, lots for me to reflect on, and I'm sure that's the same for all of our attendees. So it just remains for me to say, or to invite our attendees to say thank you to Sharon. I'd like to thank our participants and attendees. This is something that we're doing every Wednesday. If you've been before, then welcome back, and you're a much valued friend. If this is your very first one, we hope that you're going to come back and attend many more in the future. Next week, we've got the BBC presenter Damien Johnson, who will be giving a bit of a talk, so that should be great. But I'd just like to finish by saying once again, thank you so much, Sharon, for the time you've spent with us and the wisdom that you've shared. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I look forward to hopefully getting to talk to you in the future.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure spending time with you all. Thank you.
It's been a thrill. So I'd just like to wish you all a lovely Wednesday afternoon, and I hope this boost session has served its purpose and will keep you on track for the rest of the week. Thank you so much for attending, and I hope to get to see you all again soon.